I'm waving to my kids. My husband, I guess, strangely enough, decided
Oh, that's awesome.
to see it on Twitter. Hi, Remy. I guess it's better than like the garbage shows that they usually watch.
Exactly. All right. Well, I'll get started with some announcements. I'm sure people will continue to stream in. So I'm Emily Merfeld from the ACRO Resident Committee. Thank you all for being here. Just wanted to mention a couple of brief announcements. So the ACRO annual meeting is being held virtually from February 24th through the 27th. Registration is only $50 for residents. We are working hard on the resident symposium, which will be held on Friday and Saturday of that weekend. That will include a difficult cases mock oral session, a job search panel, networking event, and session on contract negotiation. So that should be a really great event and encourage all residents to join. The abstracts for the ACRO annual meeting are due on December 18th. And along those lines, we'll be offering up to 15 travel grants for that. We're working on getting the application up on our website, but for now, expect those to be due probably around January 13th. So now moving on to introducing Dr. Walker. She is a radiation oncologist with Johns Hopkins Cancer Center, currently treating patients in the greater Washington area. Previously served as adjunct investigator in the radiation oncology branch at the NCI and as associate director of radiation oncology at the FDA. So we are very fortunate to have her here today to discuss drug development with radiation and the path to FDA approval. And I think this is a topic that a lot of radiation oncology residents actually don't know a whole lot about. So I'm very eager to hear from Dr. Walker. And on that note, I will turn the virtual microphone over to her. And everyone, please remember to mute your mics.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you to everyone at ACRO and specifically Avinash, for initially inviting me to present. And Emily has been wonderful at coordinating all the logistics. So it's really a pleasure to be here and presenting this. Because it's not a conventional topic that you hear about every day, I do think it's important for you to understand a little bit about my background and experience. So I'm actually going to start kind of way back, why I even went into radiation oncology. So the primary reason was because I saw opportunities for research, specifically in terms of research with better drugs and radiation. There was so much happening on the ground that I was sort of a part of as a medical student in wonderful labs. And I thought that this field was really at the cusp of transformation. We were really figuring out how to widen that therapeutic window, and I wanted to be part of it. So I went into radiation oncology. And yet here we are still using the drugs like cisplatin, the dirty cytotoxics in combination with radiation. And then during my rad-onc residency at Hopkins, I had an interesting lab project that was looking at combined immunotherapy and SBRT. So this was right at the beginning of all of that abscopal effects hype, and the PD-1s had not even been approved yet. But I saw opportunities, for these drugs to be studied with radiation. I went to the Vail workshop, finalized the protocol, was stoked, ready to come back, really excited, and actually wanted to pitch the concept to industry. So, I wanted this to go big. And one after another, the companies basically said, no, they're not interested. And after all of these companies basically said no, I was, a little bit disheartened. And then one of my good friends and colleagues reached out to me and basically said, we could use a radiation oncologist at the FDA. He was seeing more and more drugs that were being submitted by industry in combination with radiation, and they could use a little bit of help in helping companies sort of design their clinical trials. So I took the plunge. I went to the FDA. I worked as a medical officer. I spent 3 years there. In terms of careers, some are ladders and others are jungle gyms. And mine was definitely a jungle gym because after the FDA, I went to private practice. And then I came to full circle back to Hopkins, and now I'm in academic medicine where I specialize in breast and GYN. But I think, from my experience within the agency and then doing a little bit of consulting outside the agency has provided me with a little bit of a unique perspective as a radiation oncologist. And so really the goal of my talk today is to share some of that with you as you consider your own career paths. It was a long-winded introduction, but I thought it was important. So here are my financial disclosures. I don't really think any of them are relevant to my talk today in terms of specifics. Here's the outline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the FDA, just an overview, and then the missed opportunity with drug development with radiation, dig into a little bit of the details of the approval pathways for a drug, and then talk about some of the barriers to drug development, both real and perceived, and what I see as the path forward. For the overview of the FDA, these parts of my talks always tend to put people to sleep, but I do think it's important to understand how the FDA is organized and how it functions. So try to sort of bear with me. The FDA is composed of very large centers. So each center contains offices, and then in general, each office is further divided into divisions. As a rad-onc, we should understand, I think, a little bit how oncology products are regulated. So first, in terms of cancer therapeutics, drugs, and biologics, these are regulated in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, or the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER. Imaging products are also regulated as a drug in CDER, and the regulations between these two centers are very similar. This is why they're both blue in the figure. So in order to market a drug or biologic, you need to demonstrate some degree of efficacy with an acceptable safety profile in a well-controlled clinical trial. Then we have devices. Devices are regulated in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH. And this is where linear accelerators are regulated, and also radioisotope devices like TheraSphere. And this is also where companion diagnostics are regulated, or biomarkers. Device regulations are very different than drugs. And so this means that what might be required for a drug to get approved by the FDA may not be the same for a device. So what do I even mean by approved with radiation when I'm talking about a drug? So I mean really that a trial was conducted and the FDA reviewed the data and they determined that the risk-benefit profile of the drug was favorable for that specific patient population, and so favorable that the company can then market the drug to providers and to consumers. So think sort of ASCO billboards, television commercials, etc. And the company can sell the drug. And then because the FDA approved it, payers are going to pay for the drug. So here's an example of pembrolizumab and its drug label. So as of November 20th, the pembrolizumab label or the pembrolizumab drug has 31 indications for 19 different cancer types. So here's the first 2 pages of the label. You can't read it, but the bullet points here are all, the bullet points along here are all each separate indications. And it's hard to believe, but each and every indication is supported by a well-controlled clinical trial that demonstrated efficacy with an acceptable safety profile. And the FDA actually collects the primary data sets, reanalyzes everything, and comes up with their own conclusion based on the data, how they interpret it, and their analyses. And then after that analysis, they determine the indication statement. So, and this sort of fact that the FDA actually reviews the primary data sets is why for the COVID vaccine, we haven't approved it yet. It's because, as far as I know, the FDA is the only regulatory body in the world that actually evaluates the primary data set. So they just released their evaluation, I think, this morning. That is, all the graphs are their own analysis, not the sponsors. So the indication statement is critical for the company because Medicare is going to pay for the drug in that specific patient population, and other payers are going to follow suit. But contrast that to a device indication. So here is the indication statement for the variant TrueBeam. So the indication is that the TrueBeam and Edge systems are intended to provide stereotactic radiation, precision radiation for lesions, tumors, and conditions anywhere in the body where radiation is indicated. So it's very, very broad. And as you can see, so the FDA wouldn't get involved in an indication of the expansion of radiation therapy in general, although there are some specific exceptions. But the thought is that, the specific indications often rely upon the practice of medicine rather than the FDA, because a device is a tool. So a scalpel is a tool. It doesn't come with a label telling you how to use it. And so, you can expand. Other devices are also tools. And so there's a philosophical difference between drugs and devices. And this is then reflected in how they're regulated as well. So here's a summary of different standards and sort of levels of oversight for marketing a device and a drug. So in CEDAR, as I've mentioned before, you need to demonstrate efficacy with an acceptable safety profile. Another difference is that the marketing material is actually reviewed by the FDA, and this is why when you listen to the commercials, they go through that long list of possible side effects. In CDRH, only the highest risk devices need to demonstrate efficacy, and that's not even always the case necessarily. There is an exception, the HDE, humanitarian device exception, which allows marketing of products that show probable benefit outweighs the risk. And the marketing material for devices is not reviewed at all. So there's 4 proton centers in the DC area, and they are being marketed, but the FDA is not, providing any oversight to determine if these claims are accurate. So enough on the FDA and the regulations. So if you started browsing on Twitter, you can come back now. So let's talk about what opportunities are being missed in drug development with radiation. So first, let's take a step back and look at a bird's eye view of oncology drug development. So this is a list of drugs approved by the FDA in 2018 alone. So there were 19 brand new drugs, or new molecular entities, NMEs we call them, and 38 supplements. A supplemental indication, or supplement, means the drug had already been marketed for at least one indication, but the company wants to add another indication. And in 2019, which are not shown here, but there were 11 new molecular entities and 30 supplemental indications. So in 2 years, 20 brand new drugs have come to the market for patients with cancer. But if this were sort of a live talk, and I would bother somebody in the audience and say, but so how many of those were approved with radiation? And then if you heard me speak before, you would say none. But some people like to think that we actually are developing drugs with radiation, but we're not at all. So cetuximab was the last drug approved with radiation, and that was in 2006. That was before iPhones, to put that into some sort of perspective for you, 14 years ago. So here's a list of drugs in which the product label contains an indication for the use with radiation. There's really only a handful, and those are listed here: cetuximab, Temodar, amifrosine. So right after I started at the FDA, I was sort of randomly emailing experts in the field who'd been involved with the trials of drug radiation combinations. And I spoke with Dr. Harari about his experience with cetuximab. So he described to me the sense of extreme optimism after the Bonner study was published in the New England Journal. He told me, he printed out the article, made a bunch of copies, brought them to chart rounds, he handed them out to everyone, and he told them, that he was confident this is the first of many targeted agents that we're going to see approved with radiation. And unfortunately, it was not the first of many, but perhaps there will be many, many still to come. We're still waiting. So why do I think this is a problem? What's the big deal? Let's look at cetuximab a little bit further. So it was approved in 2004, the first approval for patients with metastatic colorectal cancer, based on industry's absolute favorite endpoint for cancer trials, response rate, in a trial with 329 patients. So what does the drug actually do? Does it make a difference? So here's a trial that compared cetuximab versus best supportive care, and it actually met the primary endpoint. The median survival did improve with cetuximab. It was 6 months with the drug versus 4.6 months with best supportive care. So 6 weeks of additional survival. But at the end of the day, if you look at the tail of the curve, we're not too surprised. As we all know, these patients are still going to die of metastatic disease. So it's not surprising that these curves come together before 2 years. But radiation can kill cancer, right? So if you give a drug that makes the radiation more effective while not increasing side effects, you'll cure more people. And that's shown here with the tail of the curve after 60 to 70 months. So after cetuximab was approved initially in 2004 as a single agent, then came the Bonner study looking at the addition of cetuximab to radiation for patients with head and neck cancer. And lo and behold, we had the tail. There was an improvement in survival that appears to be durable. The bottom line is that, yes, we are missing opportunities to really improve outcomes for patients by not exploring this with more enthusiasm in terms of drug development. Some patients are diagnosed with metastatic disease, right? So they're not going to get the radiation therapy with curative intent, but there are a large number of patients who do receive that curative intent radiation, and then they relapse or progress with distant metastasis. And this group of patients, which is not a small group, but this is the subgroup of patients where I think better combinations can really push the needle and make a significant difference in the incidence of cancer-related mortality. One point worth mentioning here is sponsorship. So who sponsored the Bonner study? According to clinicaltrials.gov, it was the University of Alabama at Birmingham. So what do I mean by sponsor? I mean, who paid for the study, who submitted it to the FDA for approval? Unlike the trial that led to the first approval for cetuximab in 2004, that was the drug company who was the sponsor. They communicated with the FDA and they, paid for the study, organized the trial. And this is a recurring theme in radiation drug trials. The drug's approved based on results of a study that was supported by the company. And then the folks on the ground, either as single institutions, people in academic medicines, or with the help of cooperative groups, they take the drug and then they study it with radiation after. And that fact is really just shown here in this figure in a publication by Dr. Adaman from the UK. So here you can see there's a breakdown of studies with molecularly targeted agents in combination with radiation. Different colors represent different phase studies. And you can see the first 2 bars represent industry-sponsored and non-industry-sponsored studies. So you can see that the vast majority of studies are sponsored by non-industry sponsors. And importantly, only a very few phase 3 studies, the purple, were sponsored by industry. And that in itself is not necessarily a problem, because I think that's what cooperative groups should be doing, which is addressing the needs of patients that are not going to be met otherwise by industry. But it certainly does reflect a lack of general interest from pharma to seek indications specifically with radiation, despite the fact that, as we all know, we could be having sort of the highest impact by increasing cure rates. So not only are radiation drug trials simply not being done by industry, or at least the large ones across the board, they're often started sort of too late in the life cycle of the drug. So this is a slide courtesy of Jakob Lawrence. He performed an analysis of clinicaltrials.gov to basically evaluate the life cycle of a drug and looked at when radiation trials were started. So here we have graphs that represent 4 drugs: Avastin, Alimta, Afinitor, and lenalidomide. And then on the y-axis is the number of new trials. X-axis is year. After FDA approval, which is the yellow box on the graph, the number of trials initiated typically goes up significantly. So that means that the drug is more available. It's easier to design studies, and more investigators are going to use it in their own clinical trials. And then when the patent ends, which is the sort of the red box, the number of trials initiated each year really has plummeted by that time, and in some cases almost disappears. So in terms of the radiation trials, that's indicated in this graph by the red bar. So the drug-only trials are the blue, and they are started first. Only after FDA approval do we even start to see some red bars show up. So we're starting to look at radiation in combination, but again, only after approval. It never really picks up, We see a few studies here and there, but then by the time the patent is ending, they're really very, very few. So I have to put in a plug here for Dr. Jakob Lawrence, because that was his work. It's unpublished. He gave an excellent talk at our FDA Astro workshop in 2018. So it really gives a unique perspective of the issue. And if anyone's interested in this further, I really think you should listen to his talk. You can find it online. First, Google really any phrase that's going to get you to the workshop website. So you can Google ACR, Astro, FDA radiation workshop, something like that. But on the website, there are going to be links to the videos of the workshop. So if you click on session 1, he was the first speaker to speak. And if you go to 822, you'll be able to see his video on YouTube. It's like 10, 15 minutes, but it's really fascinating and interesting, and he has some great ideas. Okay, so we know there aren't that many drugs approved with radiation, but how does a drug even get approved? What is the benchmark? Before I go into details about the pathways, I do want to just sort of create the framework. So it's important to keep in mind that the FDA is really constantly trying to find a balance between ensuring safety and efficacy while not withholding effective therapies from cancer patients. So on the one hand, if they're too lax and they are okay with less data and less certainty behind their decisions, then we'll hear from people like Vinay Prasad, whom I respect and admire a great deal, but people like him are going to say, look, this bar is too low. You're bankrupting society by approving these drugs. There are toxic deaths, and FDA is asleep at the wheel. The agency is a slave to industry. There's a revolving door, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, if they require too much certainty, if they require too much data, and it takes too long, then you're going to hear from patients. You're going to hear from their families. You're going to hear from patient advocates, and lots of advocacy societies. And the FDA's, they're going to say, the FDA is holding back drugs. The patients really need them. People will say the FDA is stifling innovation. We need to reduce regulatory burden. My life is on the line. So it's a really, really, really tough balance. And the up and down arrows here in the middle really represent the balance that's really needed between being consistent, yet a little bit flexible when they need to be. They need to be thorough, look at everything, but they have to do it quickly and be efficient. And yet they need to be independent, not rely too much on industry, but also be interactive and collaborative. And so I think they do a really good job at striking that balance. The goal of the FDA review when they get an application, say, okay, should we market this drug, is really to look at the following. They look at the efficacy, safety, the specific disease, the patient population, the state of the science, available therapies, and they ask the question, does the product provide meaningful clinical benefit to patients? And here we get into the approval pathway. So meaningful clinical benefit, keep that in mind, but there are 2 different approval pathways for drugs: traditional approval and accelerated approval. So traditional or regular approval requires substantial evidence of safety and efficacy in a well-controlled clinical trial, which demonstrates direct clinical benefit, which is defined in the regulations as a prolongation of life, a better life, or an established surrogate of either of the 2. Also, in the regulations, it's an improvement in how a patient feels, functions, or survives. For example, overall survival is a direct measure of clinical benefit, or even PFS in some cases. Importantly, for regular approval, drugs need only to be as safe and effective as existing therapies. So you don't have to show that you're better than available therapies. You can come on the market as another option for patients. And non-inferiority designs can be used for accelerated, for traditional approval. Accelerated approval, on the other hand, this is a means to get promising drugs to patients more quickly. And so they also require substantial evidence of safety and efficacy for accelerated approval, but there's two major differences. The drug needs to demonstrate meaningful clinical benefit over existing therapies, so it has to be better than what's available now. But the evidence can be based on a surrogate endpoint that's reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Or on a clinical endpoint basically other than survival or irreversible morbidity. So the most common one that companies use to get drugs approved via accelerated approval is overall response rate. You give the drug, you measure the tumor, does the tumor shrink? You compare it to a control arm, or you look at some historical data and say our drug looks to be better. But because there is this uncertainty, we don't know, does response rate really provide clinically meaningful benefit to the patients who can't feel their tumor shrinking? Accelerated approvals are subject to the requirement that the drug needs to be studied further in post-marketing clinical trials, and the FDA, expects that these trials should be underway at the time of approval, and they should be carried out with due diligence. A very important difference between the two approval pathways, as I mentioned, is just related to the primary endpoint study, which is if you demonstrate clinical benefit based on surrogates, like response rates, you're going to get the answer more quickly. You're going to get the drug to market more quickly, but it is likely going to be accelerated approval. On the other hand, if you have an endpoint that measures clinical benefit, like overall survival, there's a lot more certainty with that endpoint, and so you're going to end up with regular. So the greater uncertainty, the more data that's going to be required to support approval in general. So the title of the talk, we're going to talk about barriers and the path forward. So I think when I thought about, what are all of the barriers, there are lots of them, but there's three major categories. I think some are real and some are perceived. So the most important thing, I think, is that radiation trials are hard. They're more complicated than drug trials. They're more complicated than combination drug trials. And during my first year or so at the FDA, I really tried to tell myself this wasn't the case. I think it's just something we have to deal with. There are many other aspects that need to be considered in a trial with radiation. The first one, we're often treating patients with curative intent, so we need to be mindful of the current standard of care. We need to ensure that the conduct of our trial is ethical. We can't withhold, potentially very effective therapy from people. But I do believe this is surmountable. I think with appropriate patient selection, appropriate disease site selection, for example, biomarker-driven inclusion criteria, select the patients who are most likely to derive benefit, and the proper informed consent. I think that there is a path forward there. Along those lines, I mentioned industry's favorite endpoint, ORR, because that's often how they end up with accelerated approval. We can't use that for radiation trials because our therapy is so effective, the tumors will shrink. So because we see responses with radiation and combinations in the frontline setting, and we have to rely on stronger endpoints like PFS and OS. Those take longer, and the trials are going to cost more money. So if you want to speed things up, you can consider novel endpoints like MRD in lung cancer or ctDNA. But from a sponsor's perspective, the novel endpoints are risky, and it often requires buy-in from the agency before embarking on the trial or before embarking on that development pathway, in which case, the company may not want to take a risk. So that takes more time and more commitment from the company. There are limitations of the non-clinical models with radiation. I mean, I don't know what else to say about that other than there are. I think everyone recognizes that a mouse is not a human. So there can be improvements made with those, but I think that we can't use the lack of non-clinical models as a reason to not study drugs in humans. We just have to move forward. Late effects are a challenge in radiation trials and radiation in general, as we know, but it's important to note that the FDA, although some people are not aware of this, the FDA probably would not require extended follow-up for late effects prior to an approval, as long as the clinical benefit was clear. So I think the FDA might say, okay, look, you have to pay attention to late effects of radiation. That would be a post-marketing requirement that you would submit the safety data, but I don't think that it would be a reason to withhold an effective combination from the market. And the last thing is just that the phase 1 paradigms weren't designed for drug radiation trials, right? They were designed for drugs. You accelerate or you increase the dose of a drug until you get the maximum tolerated dose, and then you study that in more people. But that's just not the dose-finding strategy for drug radiation trials. So, right, radiation trials are hard. I agree with that. They can be more challenging to design and to carry out than only trials, but they're not impossible. And I think as long as everyone is thoughtful about patient population and trial design, and sponsors and cooperative groups are really willing to invest the resources, we can study these drugs. So radiation trials, this is the second sort of bucket of barriers. So radiation trials are not a priority for industry, as I've alluded to before. I think, you know, I wouldn't say that they're not a priority. They do them. It's just that, you know, they haven't been quite successful, and they certainly aren't doing quite as many. But they have certainly shown more interest recently, so which is wonderful. But when trials are mostly conducted by investigators and cooperative groups, the progress is going to end up, just by the nature of how you know, the work is done, it's more protracted. The people who are in cooperative groups and the investigators, we have, like, you know, 7 different jobs, so we're not full-time focused on this trial. So it's just going to be a more protracted time course, and the resources are limited, very limited compared to pharma. So it's going to be a little bit slower. And so one issue is that, you know, few radiation oncologists are working in industry. In my opinion, this is a potential barrier, because when it's only medical oncologists, you know, at the meetings at the pharmaceutical company wondering what trials to make, you know, if there's not a rad onc in the room or they don't have experience with radiation, I think we're just sort of off their radar. And so, you know, potential solutions, I think that more radiation oncologists should consider a career in industry, or at least explore those opportunities. And when you're off on your own, not to be afraid to collaborate with industry, you know, provide education and try to really expand your network as much as you can. The other barrier, I think, is radiation quality assurance. It's a problem. It's important to isolate the effect of a drug, but it's costly for companies, and they don't even know where to begin, you know, with the QA. So I think as a field, as maybe we should all sort of take this seriously, but I think industry does need more formal guidance on QA, you know, what is really required. I think until recently, they were not even sure what data elements to collect regarding the radiation, but Astra recently came out and published a minimum data elements requirement. So that's wonderful. They at least know the data elements that they're expected to collect with the radiation in the clinical trial. And, you know, one barrier I often hear from the perspective of industry is there's a lack of regulatory precedent, and there's no, you know, clear path for companies to follow. They tend to copy each other. And so I will say that I don't think it's really an excuse. You know, we've had no regulatory precedent for authorizing the use of vaccine during the pandemic, but we're doing that. So I think it's just recognizing the importance of this work and just trying to make it happen. But of course, from a cost-benefit analysis, it may not make sense. So great segue. So now I'll just simply share 3 facts to draw your attention to one very, very important barrier when it comes to industry. So fact 1, drug companies are in the business of making money by selling drugs. So I just went through a bunch of reasons radiation trials can be more challenging, which typically means they're going to cost more. Profit, which is what the company needs to survive, equals sales minus cost. So the more the drug they sell, the longer patients need to be treated with the drug, the more common the disease, the more money they make. The amount they make in selling the drug, in general, across the board, needs to be more than the cost of developing the drug. Otherwise, they will go bankrupt. So radiation, radiation is only delivered for a few weeks, meaning each patient's just going to generate a small amount of revenue compared to patients with metastatic disease, for example, who will be taking the drug for months and months, sometimes even years. So that, in my mind, is a huge problem. You know, I don't have a solution, but again, I really encourage you to watch Dr. Lawrence's talk from the workshop, because he has some intriguing ideas that are fun to think about. And finally, what I often hear from industry is this notion that drug development uh, with radiation, should be more of a priority for the agency, but I don't think this is relevant at all. So I've heard many things from industry. We need the FDA to put out a guidance document. We need them to really spell it out for us what we need to do to tackle these complex issues that arise with radiation. What they say, without a guidance document, without lack of regulatory precedent, there are too many unknowns to prioritize funding within the industry, which, yes, that makes sense. But unfortunately, the FDA isn't going to write a guidance document until they see a need to write a guidance document and until they actually have the resources to do so. And so they haven't seen that need yet. The FDA produces these guidances really in response to any sort of expressed need from the public, from industry, from advocates, and from legislation even. It's not the other way around. I couldn't, being a radiation oncologist at the FDA, even though I really wanted to, just be like, hey guys, I need a team of people to help write a guidance document so that we can develop our drugs for radiation. Like, it's just not going to happen. And a guidance document requires like a lot of input from a lot of people to get buy-in and agreement because it's a formal document from the FDA. The other thing I hear is, there are very few subject matter experts at the FDA to provide thoughtful feedback. That might be a barrier. I don't think this is a true barrier because they could obtain outside expert opinion from the FDA, and if the FDA doesn't have the radiation oncologist, then the sponsor can educate them. So I think it's really, it's an opportunity for more collaboration, I think, than anything else. That being said, I do think more radiation oncologists should consider a career at the FDA, and I'd be happy to speak with any of you about what that might look like. And the other last one, which kind of drives me crazy, is that I hear that the FDA is going to require too much non-clinical data with radiation. Before you can study a drug in a human, you have to study it in animals in a very structured way. There's a lot of guidance documents about that. But there is this assumption that the FDA also requires similar sorts of non-clinical animal studies with a drug and radiation, and that's just not the case. The FDA assumes that we have a good understanding of how radiation works. We look at the toxicity of the drug, of the radiation. If there's any significant overlapping toxicities, we might say, okay, or they might say, start the drug lower, but in general, you don't need any specific animal studies with radiation. There are unique situations where they might want them, but in general, that's not a requirement. It's not an excuse. So what is a path forward? So here's one solution proposed by Ricky Sharma and his colleagues in the UK, which I love this diagram. So it shows the development of drugs with radiation actually happening at the exact same time that drugs are being developed as a single agent. So the purple is the core drug development program, and the blue is the radiation. So with this approach, the early phase studies with the radiation happen shortly after the first in-human studies with the drug alone. And then they ultimately do a seamless trial design where they do phase 2 together, and they launch at the same time. So that would be ideal, how it should be done. And at the bottom are potential regulatory interactions. So I think is very, very critical. And so that's the same suggestion that I proposed and published. Basically, the message was talk to the FDA because there is very little precedent with radiation drug development. So you should use the FDA as a resource to design clinical trials together. FDA always offers formal meetings to drug companies, and the companies should take advantage of that. Of course, this does delay things. It takes longer if you want to meet with the FDA, talk about your trial, and really in industry, time is money source. And finally, the importance of advocacy cannot be overstated. I think we need to be honest with ourselves. In many places, radiation is underutilized. I think in many aspects, our value is overlooked a little bit. So I just want to share a little bit here. In response to the Red Journal commentary that I just showed you in my last slide, this is actually what Vinay Prasad had to say about it. It's highlighted in yellow here. He said, it just seems old and boring, talking about radiation. I think this is kind of what oncologists think a little bit. So he did add that the FDA might be right. This feeling is something we need to get over. And I certainly agree with the last part of his statement. I think we have to help our colleagues get over it. I think we get excited about our technology, but I think a lot of fields, may sort of put us in just that bucket, that silo. We just do the technology part, and we don't think about necessarily the biology. So, I think advocacy is, is really important. So, patient advocacy. So, we should always include patient advocates in panels. I think we as radiation oncologists should really attend patient advocate events that occur. I really think this is kind of a pet peeve. We need to own up to late toxicity. We need to have more of a presence in survivorship, develop improved framework for assessing toxicities, not only in clinical trials, but everyday practice. I think it's a great idea is to meet one-on-one with local advocates, learn from them, push them on their views of radiation. I have spoken to many advocates who agree with Nate Prasad. It's just like kind of old. Like we want to move beyond that. We want something better. And offer educational programs for patients and connect with patient advocates on social media. That's a wonderful place to do that. In terms of sort of this the PR problem we have, I loved the Targeting Cancer campaign from Australia and New Zealand. If you haven't heard of them, you should definitely check them out. I think it would be just fantastic to start something like this in the US. Maybe like tone down the proton, maybe just goof up the whole radiation thing. But on a lighter note, more, I guess, positive notes, although we haven't seen a direct path to registration with radiation, meaning we haven't yet seen a drug that is developed for use with radiation actually get approved with radiation. All we see are these sort of Me Too drugs, cetuximab, approved as a single agent, then with radiation, Temodar, single agent, then with radiation, amifostine even, it's a radioprotectant, but it was first approved for toxicity management for chemo alone. Then it was approved with radiation, but we are finally seeing sort of blips of activity from a regulatory perspective that the FDA is actually being forced to pay attention now because drugs are being designed and developed for use specifically with radiation, not as single agents. So in the first time in 2020, in February, the FDA took 2 actions for radiosensitizers. These aren't approvals, they're just regulatory actions, but they're still kind of exciting. So the fast track was granted for a drug NBTXR3, which is an injectable agent for the use in patients with head and neck cancer. So fast track is a pretty low bar. It only requires very preliminary evidence that the drug might meet an unmet medical need. So the fast track was granted based on the results of a phase 1 trial with 11 patients. So 10 patients showed a CR or PR. But a little bit of a bigger deal is that breakthrough therapy designation was granted for WO 1143. And this was also in patients for head and neck cancer. Breakthrough therapy designation requires preliminary clinical evidence that indicates that a drug may demonstrate substantial improvement on a clinically significant endpoint over available therapies. And so the data in support of breakthrough for this drug was a phase 2 trial. The primary endpoint was local regional control at 8 months. I would argue, that is direct clinical benefit. 21% improvements in local regional control over the control arm, which was the standard of care. And that was a hazard ratio of 0.37 with a p-value of 0.007. There were no crazy toxicity surprises. It was predictable, manageable toxicity profile, and patients were able to receive full delivery of standard chemo radiation. So this is my last slide. So in the era of virtual elementary school, I'm more involved in my daughter's kindergarten curriculum than I ever thought really imaginable. So because of this, though, I find myself in random times sort of coming back to topics discussed in her class, like photosynthesis and fables. So the one that I helped the most with recently was the tortoise and the hare. So I couldn't help but come up with this analogy. You guys have to bear with me. I'm like a little bit nerdy, but you probably know the story of the tortoise and the hare. Despite the challenge of being a turtle, he actually wins the race against the hare. So the analogy I came up with is the prize is more patients alive and completely free of their cancer. The hare is, this represents all the drugs being developed by themselves, either as single agents or in combination with other drugs. So think like PD-1 plus this, PD-1 plus that. This approach is supported by so many people with so much confidence. They have a lot of resources. Like really fast muscles, and he's fast. And industry is just pouring billions of dollars into their development. and they look like they're really getting somewhere. You know, they're approving 30 drugs and 30 new molecular entities in 2 years is a lot. Um, and, you know, and they're hoping that they're going to cure more patients with metastatic disease with their new sexy drug. And the tortoise, you know, that's kind of like us invasive or a little overlooked or a little forgotten, you know, but here we are, maybe now 2020 finally showing up, making progress with the FDA, with these designations that I just described. And yeah, so, you know, maybe we're the tortoise. My point is being that, you know, although it's hard and challenging and we should not give up because lots of patients out there are really counting on more effective therapies. And that is it. This is our virtual kindergarten. So thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions you guys have or comments.
That was really great, Dr. Walker. Thank you. It looks like we have a question in the chat. Can you touch on what a career in the FDA looks like for a radiation oncologist?
Yeah. So the FDA, as I mentioned, there's different centers. So I worked in CEDAR for drugs. The primary work that you do as a drug reviewer is really related to interactions with sponsors. So on the first level, you have sort of a portfolio of INDs, and and you basically oversee trials, review safety reports, and then provide feedback sort of along the way to companies. They might submit an amendment, you review it, give them feedback. And then on sort of the second level, there are sponsor meetings. So industry, the companies will submit sort of a briefing document that explains their drug, their development plan, and then they ask the FDA some questions, and then you either respond to those questions in writing, or you can have a face-to-face sponsor meeting, and the face-to-face meetings are really fun. And then finally, it's the drug approval. So that's sort of like the bulk of your time is actually spent analyzing the data. You learn how to use JUMP, which is, you know, like you have a lot of smart people helping you figure out how to analyze the data. I wasn't like amazing with JUMP, so I would just think of what questions I had, then I would go to my stats people and go to these IT people and be like, this is my question, help me answer it, and do that. So that's sort of like the work itself. In addition to that, there is all sorts of opportunities for outreach. So, you know, I mean, I think I was giving a talk every month somewhere when I was there. So that's really, really fun. You can just create, you have intellectual freedom to sort of create at the FDA, you know. That's what I enjoyed the most about it, was sort of getting out there and saying, look, I'm a rad onc, you know, look, we need to do better. So there's a lot of opportunities. Everybody, you know, who, like, they're very active on Twitter, and these are my friends, so they have all found sort of their niche, you know, what are they into? And it's wonderful. I mean, we say that the F in FDA stands for family, because, you know, it's a very manageable workload. We all help each other out. You take a vacation, it's a real vacation. You turn off your computer and you don't have to turn it on. So, well, I mean, for the most part. So it's a great place to work. But I miss seeing patients, so you have to sort of be okay with that.
I'm curious, as we incorporate SBRT more into treatment for patients with metastatic cancers on some of these newer drugs, is there, like, how does radiation fit into the approval process, or does it fit in at all? Is it just up to, as physicians, us saying, oh, because I think even in clinic sometimes it's like, how long should we have them off X drug before we, you know, squeeze in our SBRT? And does the FDA have any role in that?
I will tell you, the FDA is not going to look at, right now, I don't think the FDA would look at radiation data. I can give you an example. So if you look at durvalumab, the approval, I think it's in the label, or it's in the actual the approval summary, which is like the giant book report that the FDA reviewers write. But you know, in durvalumab, it was chemoradiation followed by placebo or durva, and the patients who got the radiation, like the FDA did not even really look to see, were all of the patients given, you know, what would we consider an adequate dose. Some of them were treated to 54. You know, why was that? It's very strange. They did not evaluate that at all. And so I think that in metastatic trials, are they looking at SBRT? No, I don't think that they look at the quality of the Saber Comet and they're like, what are they getting excited about? This is a phase 2 with multiple histologies. They would not take that seriously. Now, maybe in lung cancer, I think there's 3 trials now, maybe 4, Gomez, Ingar, those trials, do look like there is some benefit. But again, if you look at it critically, and break it up, it looks like patients with maybe only one metastatic lesion might do better. So that's a good question. I don't know how much they're taking that into account, but I would say 95%, they're probably not looking at that at all.
Okay. Another question in the comments, they mentioned, they say one of your slides had talked about considering a career in industry. Can you talk about what that looks like for a radiation oncologist?
Yeah, sure. I've explored careers in industry, and I think it's, let's say, there's different aspects of industry. So I know people sort of who work in different areas. If you jump from the FDA and then work in industry, you can be sort of on the regulatory side. If you want to be on drug development side, it's a lot of working in teams. And basically a lot of the companies are divided sort of into disease sites. You'd be like on a lung team and then oversee a clinical trial there. And then lots of meetings and lots of, convincing people that your idea for this trial or that trial is what the company should do. I think that's the hardest part about working in industry, is that you might be very passionate about something. You think it needs to be done, but then if you can't get buy-in from the people who decide where is the company going to invest, it can be a little bit frustrating. That was my personal worry, that I would go to industry and I would just be like, this has to be done, but then I would not be able to get it done, and then I would be frustrated. So, but I think it's people who work in industry also seem very happy. It's very interesting, and it's like big. It's like FDA and industry. It's like big highs, big lows. It's exciting when you get a drug approved. They like have a huge party, but it's like a big task. But when it happens, that's amazing. So, yeah, just whereas clinic is like every day I accomplish like something, and I feel like a bit more fulfilled at the end of every single day with smaller tasks.
Another question in the comments, do typically the people who are, working at the FDA or working in industry also practice clinically at the same time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I was one of the only, I was generally the only radiation oncologist in the office at the time. Anand Shah was there for a little bit, and then since I left, Mitch Ansher has been there as well. So of the 3 of us, I was the only one who, no, actually Anand was doing clinic, 1 day of clinic a week, which is hard for a radiation oncologist to really have a practice. And me personally, I felt like I was, losing my skills. So that sort of led me back to clinic. But medical oncologists, they tend to do 1 day a week of clinic, and they sort of do second opinion. So patients will come in, what chemo should I get? And say, okay, I'm going to tell your doctor you're going to get this chemo. But radiation isn't really a second opinion sort of clinic. So so it was a little bit more challenging. Would the FDA be more flexible with radiation oncologists moving forward? Let them do 2 days, maybe. Can I go back to your question about the SBRT and drug trials? Because there's one caveat. If the patient only has, a couple lesions and they're going to be radiated, then they won't have any measurable lesions for RECIST. So then they won't really be eligible to follow those lesions for response rate. So that's going to be the biggest issue, is to make sure that you have at least one unradiated measurable lesion. But yeah, but other than that, I don't think they'll consider it.
Do radiopharmaceuticals fall into just the category of a drug at the FDA?
That's a really good question. Yes, they're drugs. And even imaging products are drugs. So even like the theranostics, the imaging, radiopharmaceuticals, those are all in CEDAR, and they're considered drugs. So they have a high bar to get.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that's one example of sort of when there was enough interest in radiopharmaceuticals that the FDA did come out with a guidance document on non-clinical guidance on, you know, what studies do you really need to do to make sure that the radiopharmaceutical is safe for first in human. So they were a bit proactive in that. And that's an area that I'm really excited about. I think there's going to be a lot of development there.
Does anyone else out there have questions? All right, well, I guess we can close out unless Dr. Walker, you have anything else to add, but I will just say thank you so much. This was really, really enjoyable and informative.
Yeah, absolutely. It was my pleasure. You guys can, I guess, you can message me on Twitter if you have questions. Happy to reach out. Okay, thanks so much. Oh, and tell Dr. Ferrari I said hi.
I will.
I always tell his story. I hope he doesn't mind.
I was going to tell him that I watched a presentation with his face on a slide today.
Awesome. Yeah, tell him I said hi.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.